Welcome to another video from ExplainingComputers.com. This time we're going to look at different ways of running Linux in a virtual machine in Windows. This can be useful for lots of different reasons, including if you're a Windows 10 user who wants to evaluate Linux as your future operating system. So let's go and get started. Right, here we are running Windows 10, although everything in this video will also work in Windows 11. Our computer here is an HP EliteDesk 800 G2 with a quad-core i5-6500 CPU, 8GB of RAM and a 512GB SSD. I mention this because when a virtual machine is running, a computer's resources are split between the host and guest operating systems. So, a reasonably powerful processor is recommended together with at least 8GB of RAM. To run Linux in Windows, we also need to install a hypervisor, which is an application for creating and running a virtual machine, and we'll look at some different options in this video. But regardless of which hypervisor we use, for it to support 64-bit virtual machines, we must enable hardware virtualization. And to do this, we need to reboot, so we'll get on doing that like that. And when the computer restarts, we need to press the appropriate key to enter the BIOS. Here I've pressed F10, but on your computer you may well have to press Escape, Delete or F2. So we can now turn on hardware virtualization, which on this computer we do by going across to Advanced and down to System Options, where we have the opportunity to turn on Intel's Virtualization Technology, or VTX, which enables virtualization on the CPU and which is essential for allowing multiple operating systems to run. So we will turn this on. And then we also have the option to turn on Virtualization Technology for Directed I/O, or VTD, and this allows direct hardware access for virtual machines. So we'll turn this on too. However, it's important to stress that where hardware virtualization settings are and what they are called does differ. For example, on this more modern Intel i5 system, in the UEFI we need to go across to Advanced and CPU Configuration and then scroll down to find Intel Virtualization Technology, which is the only control available and which we need to set to Enabled. And just so we've looked at an AMD system as well, on this Ryzen 5 PC we have to press F2 to enter Advanced Mode before going across to Tweaker and then Advanced CPU Settings and then SVM, or Secure Virtual Machine Mode, which again we set to Enabled. And so one of your challenges in setting up a virtual machine is finding where the hardware virtualization setting is and what it's called in your BIOS. Anyway, back here on our test system, let's flick back to main like that and go down to Save Changes and Exit like that, and we'll select Yes, and our computer will now boot back into Windows. Greetings! With hardware virtualization turned on, we're now going to install a hypervisor called VirtualBox. This is split into two components, the first of which is the base package, which is available as open source software. And then secondly, there's the VirtualBox extension pack, which adds additional functionality such as extended USB support and the ability to access a webcam. And it should be noted that whilst the extension pack is free for personal, educational or evaluation use, it requires a paid license for commercial use. So let's click on Downloads over there, and first of all download the base package from Windows hosts. There we are, we'll just save the file. And if we now scroll down a little bit as well, we can find the extension pack, one link for all platforms. We'll download that as well. And if we now minimize our browser and look in the downloads folder, we can see that in theory we can now get on with the installation. However, depending on how your system is already configured, a couple of other things may also need to be installed. And here we're on a pretty clean Windows 10 system, just so I can show you the kinds of errors that might come up and how to fix them. So let's start up by running the installer. Yes, Windows, we want to do it. And straight away we get this error message. It needs to have a Microsoft C++ package installed first, and so we'll click on OK and finish off that, because obviously we can't finish there. We know it's failed, do not panic. We will go back to the web if I can press the right button. There we are. And on this page we can get the file it requires, which is down there. And of course I'll link to this page in the video description. So let's download the right version, the 64-bit version down there, and we'll save that file. There we go. Let's run it from here. Why not? We'll agree to the license terms and install. And there we are. That was set up successfully. So once again, we'll try and run the VirtualBox installer. And this time it seems to be happy, so we'll click on Next. And we will take the defaults. And then we now get this message to say we'll get temporarily disconnected from the internet. I think we can cope with that, so we'll click on Yes. And oh look, we have our second anticipated problem. We're missing some Python core dependencies. So we will cancel the installation again. Do we want to proceed? No. Do we want to cancel? Yes, we do. And finish. And once again, we will go back to the web, where I've got the Python files we need over here. We will download Python from there and save that. And then we'll execute that file and install now. There we go. Once again, things were successful, but we can't continue because we now need to go to a command line. Who says we only do this in Linux? Well, we need to enter this command and execute. And in theory, we should now be okay. So let's have a third go at running the VirtualBox installer. Here we are again. And this time, hopefully things will be okay. We know about network interfaces. That one is all right. And clearly we've now got further. I don't mind most of these, but I do not want to have anything in the quick launch bar. So we'll get rid of that and click on Next. And finally, click on Install. And there we are. VirtualBox is now installed on our system, and we'll let it run as it wishes to, like that. I'll get rid of this. And here we have VirtualBox. But we're not quite finished yet, because you might remember back in the mists of ancient time, or in other words, a few minutes ago, we downloaded the VirtualBox extension pack. So let's add this in by going to File and to Tools and Extension Pack Manager, like that. And we will install by picking up the extension pack. There it is, and open. And it checks we want to do it, of course. Yes, we do. And we'll agree to all this at the bottom, remembering that we do have to pay if we want to use this commercially. And everything is now complete. And I think it's now high time to have a cup of tea, after which we'll create some virtual machines. Guess what? It's now time for wild excitement, as we're going to create a virtual machine. To do this, we need an ISO file for our selected Linux distro, and I've got several here in this folder, which I downloaded in previous videos. And I'll provide links for downloading these ISOs in the video description. But for now, we will launch VirtualBox. Here it is, and we'll use the menu here to go back to the welcome screen. And I think I'll also make it slightly bigger. That might be nicer for us in the video. And then to create a virtual machine, we just click on New. Next, we'll give it a name. I'm going to call this one Linux Mint. Note I put no spaces and no punctuation in that name. And then next, we need to go down and select one of our ISO files. So we'll do that down here, click on Other, and we'll pick from here Linux Mint like that. And then you'll see at the bottom of the screen down here, it says this OS type can be installed unattendedly. Or in other words, VirtualBox can automate most of the process. However, this is not available for all distros. If, for example, we go back here and go to Other and pick up, say, Zorin OS like that, it says this OS type cannot be installed unattendedly. But I'll go back to Linux Mint before I forget, I'm going to get very confused, and there it is. And in fact, although this can in theory be installed unattendedly, in practice I've found that with many Linux distros, including Linux Mint and Ubuntu, it doesn't always work or work entirely. And so I'm going to tick Skip Unattended Installation. We will do things manually, which you'll have to do for some distros anyway. So let's now click on Next, And here we need to allocate resources to the virtual machine. First, memory. I'm going to give it about half of the available memory when the machine is running, like that. And we have to also allocate processor cores, or more technically processor threads. I'll give it half of those available as well. And again, click on next. And then finally, we have to set the size for the virtual hard drive, the virtual disk on which we're installing our virtual machine. And the default is 25 gigabytes. I'm going to take that, I think, to 40. And it's worth noting that the space here will only be used when it's actually required, unless you click a pre-allocate full size, which I'm not going to do. So we'll click on next again, and we now get a summary of our virtual machine with its files to be stored in this user folder, and we'll click on finish. And as we can see, we now have a virtual machine called Linux Mint. So let's boot up the machine. We simply double click like that and the machine will boot up. And what it's going to do, as there's nothing on its virtual drive, is to boot from the ISO file as if it was a live USB or DVD media. So we'll let it run on through. And there we are, it has finished. We are now running Linux Mint from the ISO file in our virtual machine. And to install it, all we need to do is to click on Install Linux Mint, exactly as we would on real hardware. And as we can see, the install wizard has come up. I'll stick with English as my language and continue. I'm going to run through this installer very quickly because it's exactly the same process that I've covered many times in other videos, here specifically in my recent video about Linux Mint 22. So we'll go with the default of erasing disk and installing Linux Mint. This is referring to our virtual drive here, so do not panic. And we can now click on Install Now, and then click on Continue. After that, there's then just the standard parts of install, picking our location and creating an account. And the Linux Mint installation is now proceeding in our virtual machine. And there we are, it's finished. So we'll now restart our virtual machine. And here we are running Linux Mint in Windows. However, we aren't quite finished yet, because if I take the edges of this window and drag them like this, you'll see that we haven't now got Linux Mint filling the screen. And if we go to the View menu here, there is an option to auto resize the guest display. Let's toggle it off and toggle it back on again. It has changed the window back, but it hasn't resized to fit the display. And to make this work, what we need to do is to install something called guest additions, which are device drivers and apps that are installed in the virtual machine to improve its functionality. And to do this, it's very simple. We go to Devices and we go down to Insert Guest Additions CD Image, like that. And Linux Mint detects it as if a drive had just been plugged in, and it's got software we can run on it, so we'll just click on Run. And I have to enter the password I set for Linux Mint, and the guest additions should now be automatically installed. And there we are, it has finished. We'll press return to close the window as it said, and if we now try and move things like that, it does resize automatically the screen in line with the setting for auto resize guest display. And so there we are, we've successfully installed and set up Linux Mint here in VirtualBox, so I'll now close it down and celebrate our success. Now, before we move on from VirtualBox, let's look at a few machine settings. We've got our machine highlighted here, and we can click on settings for that machine. And so, for example, if we look in display, we can see we've only got 16 megabytes of allocated video memory. I think I'm going to increase that quite a bit. I think we'll take it all the way up to 128 megabytes, and I'm also going to click on Enable 3D Acceleration. It's also worth showing you if we look in General and Advanced, we can turn on a shared clipboard so we can cut and paste between our host machine here Windows and our guest machine here Linux Mint, and we're going to set this to bidirectional so we can cut and paste in each direction. And I'm also going to enable drag and drop again bidirectionally like that. So we'll click on OK, and that's our run up our Linux Mint machine. And you'll notice here as it comes up it's showing various messages. We can get rid of these messages by clicking on that there, and once you've done that once you won't see that message ever again. And here we are back in Linux Mint. It's still displaying the guest additions virtual CD, so I think we'll go to Devices, Optical Drives and we will remove disk from virtual drive just so it won't appear on our desktop. There we are. And talking of a desktop, we've enabled drag and drop in both directions. I've got a picture of a bee here in Windows. I'm going to drag it across to Linux. There it is. It's now sitting in Linux, and we can open it up. It is indeed a picture of a bee. If we want to go full screen, we can achieve that if we wish. We can go to View, and guess what? We can select full screen mode. This gives us a message which we will not display again, which says if we want to switch back, we can press what's called the host key plus F, and the host key by default in VirtualBox is defined as the right control key in Windows. So we will switch like that, and there we are now running Linux Mint full screen. Very exciting. And if I want to go back, I can press Control and F like that, and indeed I can press Control and F to go in the other direction. Although personally, I tend to go down to the bottom of the screen down here, which brings up a menu which allows us to do things like, for example, minimize the virtual machine, which is handy to go back to Windows, and we can go back to the virtual machine like that. Or we can here at the bottom of the screen also select to come out of full screen mode. Finally, something I'm often asked about is USB support. So let's leave the machine running and go back to it over here and go back to its settings. And we'll go down to USB. And we've got a USB drive currently plugged into the computer. I can show you that if we go to Windows, and there you can see we've got down here a USB drive. And if I click on the little icon here, the second one down with a plus, this will allow us to add a specific USB device to our virtual machine. So we'll click on that, and we'll click the USB flash memory there like that, and OK. And if we now minimize this and go back to our Linux machine, and we open up files like that, you'll see we cannot see our USB drive, but we'll be able to if we eject and put it back in again. So back in Windows down here, we will eject the drive, and I'll now physically unplug it and plug it back in. And there we are. Our USB drive has appeared here in Linux Mint, and it's not available in Windows. It's only available in Linux. However, if we close down our virtual machine, let's just do it like that and like that, lo and behold, we should find, yes, our USB drive is now once again available in Windows. VirtualBox is a hypervisor that I use almost every day. However, there are alternatives, and the first one I want to briefly mention is VMware Workstation Pro. Despite the name, in May 2023, Broadcom made this free for personal use, and it's certainly a very well respected piece of software that I first saw running over 20 years ago. To obtain it, we need to create a Broadcom account, which then enables us to navigate to here where we can download the software. Here is VMware Workstation Pro for personal use Windows, like that, and I can click on a release, most logically the top one, like that, and then this gets us access to the file, and if I click on a little cloud at the end to download the file, we are told prior to downloading additional verification is required. Proceed yes, no, well obviously yes, and this now takes us to a trade compliance verification page that for myself in the UK requires a great deal of personal information to be provided to export the software from the United States. And whilst Broadcom are entitled to ask for whatever they like when giving away free applications, I'm not comfortable supplying so much personal information to obtain VMware Workstation Pro when I don't have to do so to download Oracle's VirtualBox. And as I'm also not ethically comfortable using a VPN to mask my location, it's now time to move on to another way of running Linux in Windows. In Windows 11 and later versions of Windows 10, it's possible to run Linux in a lightweight virtual machine using the Windows Subsystem for Linux, or WSL. This is intended for developers, not least because by default distros install without a desktop. But regardless, I thought you might like a quick demo. To start, we need to open a command prompt, and we need to do so as an administrator, like that. There we go. And here we need to enter the command WSL and install like that. And what this will do is to install the Windows Virtual Machine platform and the latest version of WSL, which is WSL2, before downloading and installing Ubuntu. However, other distros can also be installed by instead using the command WSL install -d and the distribution name. And if you're wondering, the other distros available from the Microsoft Store are Debian, Kali Linux, Oracle Linux, and OpenSUSE. Anyway, let's now speed on through. And there we are, it's finished, and we now need to reboot. And here we are back again in Windows, where if we're lucky in the menu, yes, we can see Ubuntu. And if we run it up like this, it'll take a little bit of time to sort itself out on the first run. There we go. And although there's an error, we can now press any key to continue. And it'll ask us to enter a username. I'm going to use EC. And of course, a password. And there we are, our installation has been successful. So let's type a Linux command, for example, lsb release and -a like that, and it should show us what's installed, which is Ubuntu 22.04, so not the latest version. And we could also do something like an lsblk to see the block devices, the storage on the system. Yes, we can see that as well. So we are clearly now running Ubuntu without a desktop in Windows using WSL. And it's also possible to install a desktop environment, although for end users wishing to learn Linux in a virtual machine, I personally recommend using VMware or VirtualBox. Running a virtual machine in Windows provides just one method to experiment with and learn about Linux. Others include running Linux distros from a live USB drive, setting up a dual boot as I've detailed in another video, or perhaps installing Linux on an older computer you have around, or maybe on a single board computer like a Raspberry Pi. But whichever method works best for you, I hope you have a great time learning about and experimenting with Linux. But now that's it for another video. If you've enjoyed what you've seen here, please press that like button. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe. And I hope to talk to you again very soon.